a single note on a crumpled receipt. That was all it took to stop Harlan West cold. In the chaos of a crowded diner, forks clashing, voices raised, coffee spilling across the floor, he sat in silence, staring at crooked letters scrawled by an exhausted waitress. Mira Solon had placed it there without a word, her hand trembling, her smile brittle under the weight of Curtis Bain's shouting. No one defended her. No one dared. Yet those rushed words on a slip of paper carried something heavier than anger, sharper than insult. Harlan felt it in his chest, a pressure he could not name. Why would a stranger risk so much to leave such a message? What truth lay behind that fragile act? This was no ordinary morning, and it was no ordinary note. If you want to know why that message changed everything, leave a like so the story can continue. The table shook under Curtis Bain's hand. His voice sliced through the room, a harsh rasp that turned heads. A cup toppled, coffee sliding in a brown streak across the floor, pooling at Mira Solon's shoes. She bent down at once, napkin pressed to the mess, whispering apologies that no one seemed to hear. Curtis sneered, leaning back as if the sight of her kneeling gave him power. Around them, customers exchanged looks, some disgusted, some indifferent, none willing to intervene. Mira's face remained lowered, her shoulders drawn tight, the fragile curve of her back a picture of surrender. From the corner, Harlan West watched, his expression hardening. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing at the scene. The air inside the diner thickened as though every breath carried the weight of unfairness. And Mira, still wiping the floor, still apologizing, carried it most of all. The commotion drew another presence. Darius Kelm, pressed shirt and cold eyes, stepped forward. He ignored the coffee stain, ignored Curtis's scowl. His attention fixed solely on Mira. "You'll cover the night shift," he said, voice flat, unyielding. "No extra pay." The words dropped like stones. Mira straightened, bowed her head in silence. No argument, no defense, only quiet acceptance. The room seemed to tilt, every ear catching the command, every eye registering her submission. Leona Vey, pale and anxious, glanced from across the counter, worry etched on her face. Curtis smirked, satisfied, before turning back to his plate. Harlan's hand curled into a fist on the table, the tendons straining against his skin. Authority had spoken, not to protect, not to correct, but to crush. The injustice had grown sharper, heavier, settling over every table like a shadow that would not lift. Mira returned to her work as if nothing had happened. The tray, balanced on her arm, trembled, but her lips stretched into a smile, thin, brittle, pasted in place. Her eyes betrayed her empty pools that flickered with exhaustion. Sweat darkened the fabric at her back, clinging to her skin. A customer muttered a cruel aside as she set down their plate. She bowed her head, murmured another apology, and moved on. The words slid off her like rain off glass, but each left its mark beneath the surface. Across the diner, Harlan watched, his brows drawn tight, unsettled by her endurance. It was a quiet kind of suffering, no shouting, no tears, just the steady breaking of a person forced to swallow every insult. The smile never left her face. That, perhaps, was the cruelest part of all. The tray slipped before anyone could catch it. Plates clattered, silverware skittered across the tiles. Curtis Bain's roar came instantly venom-sharp in every syllable. Clumsy fool, Leona froze, her face drained of color, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The diner's murmur dropped into silence, all attention fixed on her humiliation. Before the weight could crush her, Mira stepped forward. "It's my fault," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She reached for the scattered dishes as though she had been the one to drop them. Curtis snorted, sank back into his chair, and waved her away. The moment passed for the others, but not for Harlan West. He leaned forward slightly, gaze fixed on Mira, the sacrifice not lost on him. One woman carried both burdens, the spilled tray and the unspoken pain, while another stood hollow in her shame. Harlan sank deeper into his seat, eyes never leaving Mira. Each gesture she made etched itself into him, the steady hands that still trembled when no one looked, the smile stretched too thin, the rhythm of service that disguised exhaustion. His breath slowed, heavy, each inhale dragging against the silence pressing around him. Mira moved from table to table, her pace unbroken, her posture upright as though nothing had happened. Yet every detail betrayed the truth. The damp strands of hair sticking to her forehead, the slump of her shoulders when she turned away, the glint of sweat dripping onto the wooden table she leaned over to wipe. The diner buzzed, but between Harlan and Mira there was only stillness, charged and suffocating. Something about her endurance struck him deeper than the insults ever could. The calls came, one after another, overlapping, urgent, demanding. Customers snapped their fingers, raised their voices, more orders piling atop the chaos. Darius barked from the counter, "Move faster." His command cracked like a whip. Mira darted between tasks, clearing one table even as another shouted for coffee. Her hands blurred, her chest rose in frantic rhythm. Leona stumbled caught in the storm and sank into a chair with a gasp, unable to steady herself. Mira glanced at her but could not stop. The strain bled into every corner of the diner. Harlan shifted his body, leaning forward, half rising as if to intervene, but he forced himself back, nails digging into his palm. The pressure refused to relent, pressing down on everyone inside, but it seemed only Mira bore its full weight. In the lull between orders, Mira slipped into the back. She glanced around once, then reached for a crust of bread left from the morning. It was hard edges curling, but she tore off a piece and chewed quickly, her jaw working as though she feared being caught. Her eyes strayed to the doorway, watching for footsteps, every second hurried. She lifted a cup of water to her lips, both hands gripping the glass, trembling as she swallowed. It was not hunger, satisfied, only hunger, quieted. In that dim space, the truth of her weariness revealed itself. From where he sat, Harlan caught the glimpse, her hollow gesture, her secrecy, her shame. The image burned into him a sharper wound than Curtis's shouting. A woman running on crumbs, still smiling for others, still apologizing for things she did not do. Her apron pocket buzzed. Mira pulled out the phone thumb, brushing the screen with hesitation. She whispered, "I'll be late." "Eat first, all right?" A child's voice answered, faintly soft and obedient, "Yes, Mama." The sound tender, yet resigned, carved into the silence. Mira's lips pressed, tight teeth biting down her eyes, shining with restrained tears. She forced her voice steady, ended the call quickly, then stood motionless for a heartbeat, clutching the phone like a lifeline. In that pause, she was not a waitress, but a mother stretched, thin-bearing more than her frame should hold. Then, without a breath to spare, she tucked the phone away and returned to the din, to the orders, to the noise that did not care. Harlan had seen enough to know there was someone waiting, and she could not fail them. Alone at his table, Harlan unfolded the slip once more. The words jagged and hurried, cut deeper each time his eyes ran across them. His gaze darkened the muscles along his jaw, flexing as though the ink itself accused him of something unspoken. He pressed the paper flat fingertips, trembling, unable to let it go. The diner swirled around him, laughter-clatter voices rising, but for him there was only silence and that uneven handwriting. The note did not fade. It grew heavier, insistent, burrowing into his chest. He whispered under his breath, low and certain, "I have to understand." The vow was not loud, not heard by anyone else, but it was enough. A line had been crossed. Curiosity was no longer passive, it had hardened into obsession. Harlan leaned forward, his voice low, almost careful, as he asked Mira a simple question about the menu. She paused, turned slightly toward him, and gave a clipped answer, her smile brief, almost forced. The reply was functional, not welcoming, as though every syllable had been weighed before spoken. Her eyes flicked past him, landing anywhere but his face, the counter, the window, the floor. He tried another question, softer this time, hoping to open a crack in the wall she had built. She nodded, once murmured a phrase no longer than 2 words, then excused herself. The distance she carried was more than physical. It was deliberate, a boundary drawn in silence. Harlan sat back, swallowing the words that rose to his lips. For the first time he felt her as more than weary, he felt her guarded. And the mystery deepened. The back storage room smelled of dust and detergent. Leona Vey leaned against the shelves, her voice breaking in the dim light. She spoke of wages too thin to live on, of shifts piling without relief, of colleagues leaving one by one. Her words tumbled out sharp with despair, but softened by exhaustion. Mira stood nearby, quiet, her chest rising with a sigh that said more than words could. She did not argue or comfort, only breathed in, breathed out as though agreement lived in silence. From the hall, Harlan paused, hearing their voices seep through the crack in the door. He pictured them both in that half-lit space weighed down by the same invisible chains. No laughter, no hope, just 2 women holding up a broken system with their bodies. And he knew the rot reached deeper than one cruel customer. The door clanged as Curtis Bain strode in once more, his voice already dripping venom. He called Mira across the room, his words jagged and cruel, rude, disrespectful. The accusation struck like a slap. Mira froze mid-step, her face paling, lips pressed tight. Before she could speak, Darius Kelm interjected with cold certainty. "She's at fault," he declared, siding with the customer without hesitation. The judgment landed heavier than Curtis's insult, echoing in the silence that followed. Mira stood still, bearing the weight, her chest rising as if each breath cost her. Around them, no one spoke. Curtis smirked, satisfied at her humiliation. Harlan's hand tightened on the table's edge, knuckles, white fury surging beneath his calm exterior. What had begun as one man's cruelty had now been sanctioned by authority, and that betrayal stung far more. Mira lowered her head, the slip of paper crumpled in her grip. The edges dug into her palm, yet she held on as though it anchored her to silence. Her eyes shimmered red at the corners, but no tears fell. Her back curved inward, her frame smaller under the weight of accusation. Not a word escaped her lips. Around her, the diner hushed. Voices dimmed, forks rested midair. The silence was not protective, but complicit. Each face turned away to avoid the shame of seeing. Mira remained rooted, her posture both fragile and stubborn, absorbing humiliation without defiance. It was a picture no one could misinterpret, a woman pressed down until even dignity bent. And in that moment, she was utterly alone. That night, Harlan lay awake, the ceiling a blur above him. His hand clutched the receipt, the inked scrawl burning into his memory. Each word echoed in his mind over and over, louder with every repetition. The lamplight cast a sickly yellow, throwing shadows across his face. His breath came uneven, chest rising with the weight of unease. The note had ceased to be a fragment of curiosity. It was now a demand, relentless in its pull. He turned it over, pressed it flat, as though the truth might seep through the paper if he held it long enough. His lips moved, shaping the vow only he could hear, "I need to know." The promise clung to him as tightly as the sleepless dark. The diner filled again, the morning rush spilling over with clamor. Mira wove between tables, her steps brisk movements sharpened by repetition. Each tray she carried seemed heavier, each smile thinner. Harlan sat apart, his eyes following every gesture, the flick of her wrist, the quick bend of her back, the weariness masked beneath efficiency. At a nearby table, Curtis Bain lounged, his gaze cutting toward her with familiar disdain. The tension thickened, invisible but palpable, hanging above every interaction. Every sound felt amplified, the scrape of chairs, the call for orders, the snap of Darius's instructions. Mira's pace quickened, but the weight pressing down on the room only grew. Harlan leaned forward, sensing it before it broke, certain that something inevitable was about to give way. The crash silenced the room. Leona's tray, tipped porcelain, struck the floor, splintering into sharp fragments. The sound rang out too loud, too final. Darius's voice followed in an instant, a bellow that cut through every ear. His anger fell not on chance, not on circumstance, but squarely on Mira. Before Leona could stammer a word, Mira stepped forward, bowing her head. "It was my mistake," she said, steady, though her hands trembled. The blame settled onto her as if it had always belonged there. Curtis smirked at the scene, a predator satisfied. Around them, customers exchanged uneasy glances, unwilling to step in. Harlan's throat tightened, fury climbing with nowhere to go. His chest constricted, his hand pressed flat to the table nails, biting into skin. The weight of injustice had piled too high, and he could taste the bitterness of silence. Later, in the dim hush of the storage room, Mira collapsed against the wall, her small frame folding into itself. Hands shielded her face, muffling the shallow sobs that slipped out despite her effort. Her shoulders shook, fragile as paper in the draft. A single tear traced down her cheek, falling to the cold concrete, spreading into the dust. She hugged her knees as if making herself smaller might ease the blow. Outside, footsteps came and went, but none stopped. No one reached in. The world continued busy and indifferent. Through the cracked door, Harlan watched, frozen. His chest ached, his body drawn taut by a helpless anger. He had seen her endure insults, orders, exhaustion. But here, in this hidden corner, he saw the truth, pain she could not disguise, and it left him raw. Leona entered quietly, her voice soft but unsteady. "You don't deserve this," she whispered, crouching beside Mira. Mira lifted her head, a faint, crooked smile breaking through the tears. "It's fine," she said, the lie sharp in its fragility. Leona reached out fingertips, brushing Mira's hand, a gesture as small as it was defiant. The silence stretched between them, heavier than words. Outside the door, life clattered on, but in that still room, two women bore the weight of a truth no one else would claim. Harlan lingered in the hallway, eyes shadowed, his gaze fixed through the crack. He had heard enough to know the injustice was not imagined. It was real, suffocating, and shared. His heart sank, his resolve hardened. Something inside him began to shift. The receipt lay between his fingers once more, edges softened from constant folding. Harlan stared at the crooked ink, his jaw set. This was no longer a puzzle to glance at between orders. It was a demand, a voice written in haste yet echoing with force. His chest tightened as the words pulsed in his head. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "I need to see for myself." The thought steadied him, turned uncertainty into resolve. His pulse quickened, each beat louder, urging him toward action. The murmur of the diner faded into background noise. All that mattered was the truth behind Mira Solin's silence, her note, her weary eyes. That night he waited near the door, every sense alert. The moment she walked out, he would follow. He would no longer rely on guesses. He would witness. Mira slipped out into the evening, her thin jacket sliding from one shoulder. The street was slick from earlier rain reflections trembling beneath flickering lamps. She walked slowly, shoes dragging against the pavement, each step heavy with fatigue. Behind her, Harlan kept distance, careful, deliberate. His breath grew louder in his chest, a rhythm set to the soft scrape of her soles. The night felt stripped bare, no cars passing, no voices, only the sound of two lives moving in uneven harmony. Mira's frame seemed smaller against the darkness, fragile beneath the unkind light. Harlan's eyes stayed fixed on her, compelled, yet uneasy. He had crossed into her world beyond the diner, a place where the weight she carried might finally show. His anticipation thickened, caught between dread and discovery. Mira stopped at a small shop, its paint-faded windows clouded. She pushed the door with care, as though even that effort cost her. Inside, she chose a stale loaf of bread, a single bottle of water. At the counter, she opened her palm coins, clinking against one another. She counted them twice, her fingers trembling before sliding them forward. The shopkeeper's eyes softened with pity, lingering on her thin frame. Mira lowered her gaze, murmured thanks, and took the bag with both hands. Outside, she adjusted the weight as if it mattered. From the shadows, Harlan's brows drew tight, a question pressing harder than ever. Food this meager bought with such strain, what could she be planning to do with it? The mystery deepened with every step she took away from the store. On the edge of the street, huddled against a wall, sat a man whose body seemed made of rags. His coat was shredded, his eyes vacant, staring at nothing as if the world had long forgotten him. Eldon Mar shivered in silence, a shadow among shadows. Mira approached her steps, slow, deliberate. She crouched, lowering the bag into his trembling hands. Bread water, simple, essential. Eldon's fingers shook as he clutched them, his voice breaking into a whisper. "Thank you." Mira's smile flickered, brief but warm, a fragile light in the dark. For her, the gesture carried no ceremony. It was instinct, kindness woven into survival. From a distance, Harlan felt the weight of revelation. This woman, who absorbed insult, who carried silence like armor, was also carrying compassion others had long abandoned. And it unsettled him more than cruelty ever could. Later, Mira climbed the stairs to her rented room. The door creaked, revealing a space barely large enough to hold a bed and a desk. The walls were blotched with damp stains, the air heavy with fatigue. She dropped her bag to the floor and sank onto the hard mattress, her frame bending with exhaustion. A yellow bulb flickered above, painting her face in shadows, each line of strain etched deeper. She reached for a worn notebook, its pages filled with numbers scratched in careful rows. Debts listed added, carried forward. At the center of the book, pressed flat and creased, a photograph of a young boy smiled faintly from the page. Mira's eyes lingered there, her lips pressing into a line. In that moment, she was not a waitress nor a servant to strangers, she was a mother keeping tally of survival. From outside, Harlan stood motionless, the faint light spilling through the window, casting Mira's silhouette against the curtain. In his hand, the receipt was folded tight edges, damp from his grip. His chest swelled with emotions he could not name, anger, pity, shame, all converging at once. He closed his eyes, lines creasing deeper across his brow as if the strain of seeing too much pressed down on him. His throat tightened, his body heavy, yet he could not turn away. Softly, a whisper broke from his lips. Why does it have to be this way? The question carried no answer, only the weight of realization. What he had witnessed was not misfortune passing by, it was a truth lived daily, carved into her bones. And he could not unsee it. In her cramped room, Mira sat with a pen poised above another scrap of paper. The ink faltered as her hand trembled, letters leaning unevenly across the page. She wrote without pause, as if the words had been waiting to spill a smile from a customer. Sometimes feeds us more than a tip ever could. It was not complaint, not sarcasm, but a plea dressed in gentleness. Outside, Harlan unfolded the receipt he had carried for days, eyes running again over the messy scrawl. For the first time, the meaning unlocked itself. It was not defiance, but a fragile truth. The ink seemed to burn hotter than accusation. His breath caught chest constricting as the enormity of what she had meant sank in. This was no ordinary note. It was survival written as hope, hope written as hunger. Morning came heavy with routine, but in the dim storage room the air was different. Mira sat beside Leona, her voice raw, stripped of the practiced smiles she wore outside. She spoke haltingly, each word carrying the weight of memory. A husband who raised his hand more often than his voice. A home lost broken under debts and fear. Nights of running, days of scraping, and the silence she learned to endure. Now, only the diner, only this job kept her child clothed and fed. Leona pressed her palms to her face, tears slipping through her fingers before she reached out and pulled Mira into her arms. For once, Mira allowed herself to lean, her body trembling against the comfort. In that closed space, the truth was no longer hidden. It spilled and settled too heavy for anyone else to carry. That evening, Harlan sat in his parked car, the city lights ablur through the windshield. In his hands, the receipt was damp edges curling from sweat. His fingers trembled as he held it, but not from cold. His chest rose sharply again and again, struggling against the tide inside him. His eyes' stung vision blurred the words etched on the paper, flashing every time he blinked. "I was wrong," he whispered to himself, the admission shaking loose in the silence. Wrong to dismiss her note. Wrong to doubt her endurance. Wrong to mistake her quiet for weakness. The realization struck not with force but with collapse, a surrender of judgment. Beneath it, something new began to grow. A choice forming slow but certain, shaping itself into resolve. Back at the diner, Mira moved through the crowd with the same calm grace. Her body sagged with fatigue, but her smile never wavered. She greeted each guest with courtesy, a warmth that seemed impossibly steady given the bruises left by yesterday's insults. Leona brushed past her, leaning lightly against her shoulder in passing, as if drawing strength from that quiet endurance. Mira's eyes carried a faint shimmer, brighter than before, though the weariness beneath was plain. To her, every gesture remained deliberate, refilling water, offering a nod, listening with patience. There was no bitterness in her service, only a quiet dignity that refused to bend. Watching from his seat, Harlan felt something shift inside him. His lips curved in the smallest of smiles, unbidden. The woman he had come to observe was no longer just a mystery. She had become his proof that resilience could be clothed in gentleness. In his rented room, Harlan stood before the mirror. The disguise that had cloaked him for days felt suddenly suffocating. He pulled the thick glasses from his face, set them down. The worn shirt and cheap jacket followed, folded in a heap. What remained was the man few ever saw in such solitude, Harlan West, the CEO whose decisions shaped entire lives. His features sharpened under the bare light, every line etched with determination. The uncertainty that had haunted his sleepless nights was gone, replaced by a clarity he could not turn from. He studied his reflection, searching for hesitation, but found none. His voice, low but resolute, escaped without effort. "It's time." The words sealed his resolve, a promise not only to himself but to the woman whose note had torn open his guarded heart. The diner buzzed with the clatter of plates and voices, the morning rush at its peak. Amid the motion, a new presence stepped through the doorway. Harlan West entered without disguise, his bearing transformed, no longer the anonymous figure hiding in corners. The air shifted as he crossed the floor, his stature commanding his face, stripped of pretense. Staff paused, sensing the weight of his arrival, though none yet grasped its meaning. Mira turned from a table, a tray balanced in her hand, and stopped mid-step. Recognition flickered in her eyes, confusion shadowing her expression. For the first time, she truly saw the man who had been watching in silence, and for the first time he allowed himself to be seen. The clamor of the diner broke into silence as Harlan's voice cut through, firm and undeniable. "I am Harlan West." The words settled heavy in the air. Forks hovered, conversation stalled, every gaze fixed on him. Mira's hand trembled, the tray rattling against her grip, eyes wide with disbelief. Leona lifted both hands to her mouth, her breath caught in her throat. At the counter, Darius stood motionless, color draining from his face. The recognition spread like fire staff, and patrons alike frozen as they realized the quiet man in plain clothes was no ordinary guest. A ripple of unease moved through the room, the balance of power shifting in a single breath. For Mira, the truth rang louder than any insult he had been there watching, knowing all along. Harlan's gaze turned sharp, fixing on the man behind the counter. "How do you explain this?" His tone brooked no escape. Darius's lips parted, but only fragments spilled, broken phrases, excuses, tangled in sweat. His shirt clung damp to his back, the weight of authority slipping from him with every stammer. Around the room, employees exchanged glances, whispers passing like sparks they had suffered, and now the truth stood plain. Curtis, who once reveled in his cruelty, sat still, shrinking under the shift in power. Mira lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in disbelief, as if the scene unfolding was beyond her imagining. Darius faltered, the strength of his voice gone, every lie collapsing under the scrutiny of the man, now unmasked. Harlan drew himself upright, his words carrying across every corner. "From today, wages will rise for all. Overtime will be paid. No more silence, no more disregard." The declaration fell like thunder. For a moment, stillness held. Then the room erupted. Employees gasped, voices lifted in disbelief and joy. Leona pressed her hands to her face, tears streaming freely, her body trembling as though released from a weight long carried. Mira gripped her palm tight against her chest, unable to speak, breath caught in her throat. Around them, the din of hope filled the space once marked by despair. The air shifted lighter, brighter, alive with possibility. A single decision had redrawn their world, and it began here in the place they thought they would always be unseen. The room still buzzed from the promise of change when Harlan turned, his expression softening. His eyes found Mira in the crowd, small yet unshaken, the quiet center of everything he had witnessed. His voice lowered, yet carried weight. "And for you, Mira Solon, there will be something more. A reward for the strength you've shown, the kindness you've kept, even when the world gave you none." The words fell into the silence, landing with force greater than applause. Mira froze, lips trembling, the sound caught in her throat. Her disbelief radiated through her trembling hands. From the side, Leona burst into cheers, her joy unrestrained. Then came the wave of clapping, a thunderous rhythm of voices rising, feet stamping, palms striking in celebration. For once, Mira stood not as a shadow, but as the one everyone looked toward. Mira lifted her hand to her face as if the gesture alone could dam the flood inside her. But the sob escaped anyway, a choked sound that broke the clamor of applause. Her shoulders convulsed, fragile in their trembling. In an instant, Harlan stepped forward, his arms folding around her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his stature. She shook against him, body racked with relief and grief, the tears soaking into his chest. The room hushed, voices fading, the applause softening into reverent silence. All eyes turned not in pity, but in awe. In that embrace, every humiliation, every silence she had swallowed found its answer not in words, but in presence. It was a moment carved into memory, unadorned, raw, and unbearably human. Harlan lifted his head, his voice resonant but calm. A single slip of paper, a few shaky lines of ink. "And yet it changed my heart, and now it will change this company." His words hung heavy, not as corporate promise, but as confession. Mira looked up at him, her eyes swollen, glistening with gratitude and disbelief. Leona stood nearby, nodding through her tears, her hands pressed tight to her chest. Around them, no one dared interrupt, not even with applause. Silence spread deep and solemn, as if each person feared to disturb the gravity of the moment. The truth had been spoken plain and unvarnished. What was once just ink on paper had become a vow sealed before them all. One by one, the workers reached for each other's hands. A chain of tired palms linked together, carrying not fatigue, but relief, even pride. The air felt lighter, as if years of weight had been lifted in a single morning. At his table, Curtis lowered his head. No words, no fight left in him. He sat small, shrunken by the tide of change that moved around him. And then Eldon Marr was guided inside, shoulders, hunched, eyes darting. A chair was pulled out for him. Mira poured him a glass of water, her smile quiet, kind, unshaken. The gesture needed no speech. Fairness had entered the room, and for once it stayed. A voice, steady and low, carried across the room. One small act can turn the course of a life. The truth hung in the silence. Harlan's gaze fell on Mira. Hers turned to Eldon. In the space between them, something unspoken passed, a recognition of wounds of endurance, of grace. Harlan's features softened, the hardness in his eyes dissolving into calm. For the first time, peace felt possible. Mira smiled, her eyes catching the light bright as if a storm had finally cleared. The moment fixed itself not as spectacle but as permanence, an instant no one present would forget.